Chronic Illness Therapist podcast. This is meant to be a place where people with chronic illnesses can come to feel heard, seen, and safe while listening to mental health therapists and other medical professionals talk about the realities of treating difficult conditions. This might be a new concept for you, one in which you never have to worry about someone inferring that it's all in your head. We dive deep into the human side of treating complex medical conditions and help you find professionals that leave you feeling hopeful for the future. I hope you love what you learn here, and please consider leaving a review or sharing this podcast with someone you love. Are just kind of looking to learn the basics of acceptance work. What does it mean, and what skills can help you kind of lean into acceptance? We talk a lot about acceptance on this podcast and what it is and what it isn't. So I won't repeat that all here. But if you'd like to sign up for this membership, I'm still kind of figuring out exactly what it's going to entail, but I know it will at least have videos, training videos, and a transcription with each video, as well as like some worksheets when applicable. And eventually the goal is to have a community where people can chat with each other and kind of like a Facebook group, but I don't think it'll be on Facebook. I think it'll be on a different platform. So I'll keep you updated on that. If you're interested in learning more about that as I learn more about it and exactly what it's going to be, then sign up for the email list, and the link will be in the show notes. And I won't spam you with lots of emails, but just updates about what's going on in the membership and what it all entails. So thanks. Matthew Morse was born in 1962 and grew up in suburban St. Louis, Missouri, and Tacoma, Washington. He spent a lot of his teenage years cycling on the open roads of Washington State, and as an undergrad, he studied philosophy and some ancient Greek at St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. From 1986 to 1987, he studied poetry under Allen Ginsberg, Robert Creeley, Philip Wallen, Clark Coolidge, and the disembodied spirits of Jack Kerouac and Ted Berrigan at Naropa University. Matthew has a deep love of the arts and is an accomplished amateur folk poet. Since 1988, he's been engaged in Tibetan Buddhist psychology and the practices of the body, speech, and mind, so these deeply inform his therapeutic view. But he's also partial to psychodynamic exploration, existential psychology, and even CBT. Matthew has lived in New York City since 1994, and he worked in the magazine and luxury good industry for about 20 years. He's been married for 27 and has 2 adult daughters. In 2015, he trained as an interfaith chaplain at Mount Sinai Hospital, and then he worked for nearly 6 years in end-of-life care at Calvary Home Hospice. In 2016, he volunteered as a test subject for a research study at Johns Hopkins University on the effects of psilocybin on long-term meditators. He picked up a master's degree in counseling from Fordham University and is now a licensed mental health counselor in the state of New York. He has a private psychotherapy practice based in New York City and, of course, Zoom. I would love to know a little bit about you and your practice. You're in New York City, how long you've been practicing, and just tell me a little bit about your work.
Thank you, Destiny. I just started a private practice here in Manhattan, but prior to this, which I just opened this practice a month ago, I'm in Union Square in Manhattan. I have an office. I'm old school. I still like to see people in 3 dimensions, and I'm building a practice. And prior to this, I worked in hospice care, and first I started as a chaplain. I was a trained chaplain, Buddhist chaplain, but interfaith chaplain. And then from there, I went to school and got a degree in counseling and passed and did my exams and whatnot. So I've worked on both sides of death, both before the death and after the death. With the grieving family. Now, and I have had a lot of experience also with chronic illnesses because I did my training at Mount Sinai Hospital. So I was actually on the gastrointestinal unit. So I spent a lot of time with various transplant peoples, as well as with Crohn's and irritable bowel syndrome, and then a lot of some sickle cell anemia people. So I've had a range of experiences, and that's me. That's me. That's
amazing.
That's my practice. Yeah.
Awesome. Can you tell me, when you were working in hospice and seeing chronic illness, is there a theme you came across with the particular patients you were talking with? Any kind of theme, whether that was uh, about their belief system. Sometimes, when we're on death's
Mm.
bed, we start to think more about these things. Or what were some of the things that just came up during that time for you?
Well, are you referring to chronic illness or terminal illness?
That's a good question. Can you speak to both, or is there one over the other that is,
I can I can speak to both. They are related. I think that any illness, if it's serious enough, if it's intense enough or has long duration, it wakes us up to the fact that we're mortal and human, that we're fragile, vulnerable, that impermanent, that this body isn't so reliable, maybe not this world. Sadly, sometimes our interpersonal relationships aren't reliable either. And so it really depended on the person I met and where they were in the trajectory of their diagnosis. I met people who were been worked with people who were young and they had to 19 years old and they had to leave college because they had their first Crohn's flare up and their parents were there, thank God, to help them. And and then I've also worked with people who had the illness all their lives or for decades and who have very sophisticated coping mechanisms. So what you discover is that people mature and develop, hopefully through with support of therapists and family and friends, that they can develop ways of coping with their challenge.
that makes perfect sense. What were some of the coping mechanisms that you either saw to be most powerful or maybe the most um, prevalent?
Hmm. Well, I have to say, people do get spiritual when they get older or near death. And let's face it, chronic illness comes to most of us if we're lucky enough to make it to 70. I'm 60 right now, so I'm fine. A little mild eczema that I control with the right skincare, but, I've been very blessed, very fortunate. And I mean, I'm what's called a first degree relative of chronic illnesses. My mother had adult onset juvenile diabetes and comorbid persistent depressive disorder, and even more strangely, Huntington's disease runs in my family. So I've been around it a lot. But so what a lot of people, there's that joke, there are no atheists in the foxhole, but reality there are sometimes atheists in the foxhole and they can handle it and weather their illness and eventual dying process with grace and dignity. It's entirely possible. I'm not of that ilk. I make that leap of faith. I i joke about it. I call it my positive self hallucination. Because I'm educated. I'm able to be skeptical, but yeah, I find it very useful to have a sense of transcendence after this life, to love both this life and the life hereafter. In my Buddhism, we have future lives, past lives. I don't have any true insight into that, but I do find it a marvelous coping mechanism and a way of expanding things so that I can deal with the wild unfairness of life. But I've seen many, so that's a general, it is a tendency. People ask the big questions, they do a life review, they go back to who gave them the most love in this life and who they've given a lot of love to. They meditate on love and gratitude, and so that they can love both this life and the next life, so that they can have peace of mind. Maybe and they can, sometimes they do become more spiritual, but I've seen very few deathbed conversions, to be honest with you. And then although I'm sure there are a lot of conversions within the chronic illness trajectory, especially if people have it when they're young. It can, because it's spiritual coping mechanism. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's also maybe a lot of deconversion or conversion to, from growing up religious to sometimes or spiritual.
Mm,
Usually you grow up with a religion, right? And then
right.
a lot of times maybe it's just the age, 20, 30,
Hmm.
you are
Hmm.
not yet asking, I think, those big questions. I think you're more so asking the why questions. Why did this happen? Instead of how,
Hmm.
which kind of, I think, can lead to some of the more deconstruction of faith and
Hmm.
spirituality.
Hmm.
And then you start to, I think, as you get older, ask more of those. I like what you said, like people on they're asking these questions, these big life questions, and trying to
Right.
just kind of reflect and make meaning and sense of it all.
Right. Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. Most people, when they're young, they're it's about, to be Darwinian, it's survival and reproduction, or it's money and sex, and I don't know which order. It's whether we're conscious of it or not, it is an evolutionary drive that defines us as animals and people. And then as we get older, when we face our mortality and we see our other friends, see enough of our other friends die, or maybe if we've been hurt by other losses, such as a out of the blue betrayal or divorce, or something horrifically unfair, but then we ask, what's it all about? And some people go through a phase of what we call spiritual struggle, where they ask God or the infinite, why me? Why this? And that's a big feature in Judaism. People argue with God in Judaism, but yeah, and it can be that's a natural phase to go through that, and I've worked with people through that, and I basically just meet them where they're at. You know, I just that's where they are.
Yeah. Do people tend to find you because they are already using spirituality as a coping mechanism and they're seeking somebody who can help them hone that? Or would you say that it's maybe a mix of people that come to see you?
Oh, well, it's a bit of a mix. I was trained. All chaplains train as interfaith chaplains, and then they identify as one thing or another. It's sad but true. They become, oh, I'm a Catholic chaplain, or I'm a Protestant, or I'm Buddhist. So I always got the strange people that were spiritual but not religious. Lovely people. I got the wonderful creative people. And here in New York, some of them are the most fascinating people. A lot of them are artists, and they've had interesting careers, and they're open and creative. They're not into absorbing or following the dogma. But as you did bring up earlier, there are a lot of people who return to their ancestral, their roots. And so if I meet someone who went to Catholic school when they were young, and maybe now they're 70 and dying of cancer, and they've had a year of, they were baby boomers. They experimented with psychedelics and maybe played around with Buddhism, Hinduism, traveled to India, who knows? But when they get old, they do go back. They do go back to those those ancestral roots. It's a combination of the two. Depends on the person, but yeah, but I had very few real Buddhists towards the very end, but I did have some that were quite remarkable, and so I could deeply connect with them. But also, I was raised Episcopalian, so I would connect with my Christians and Catholics like Episcopalians. So I was fortunate,
Yeah.
and and then I love the arts and the meaning making that's involved in the arts, and I think um, I always lo- I always love to ask my 12-step clients, patients, what their idea of their higher power is, and I always it's so amazing to see the diversity of people's conceptions of that which cannot be conceived. It's
Oh,
yeah,
yeah. It
yeah,
requires creativity. It requires art to even
yeah.
think about that question.
I think so. Yeah, yeah. I had one beautiful gentleman once. He was dying, and he said that for me, heaven is the voice of Ella Fitzgerald in the air, and that
That's
was
wonderful.
and he was sticking with that. Yeah.
I love that. Um, yeah, can you maybe speak a little bit more to what it even means to go back to someone's roots? I know that could sound really simple, but for someone who's never even thought about that before, what might that start to look like for someone?
For someone who never, they had roots, but they've, well,
Yeah, they
what
haven't thought
age?
about their ancestors or what practices or traditions, they kind of, yeah, and
Mhm.
so yeah, what would that look like if someone were curious about that? Like, what does that mean?
Well, how old are we? Is this ideal, this client we're thinking of?
Maybe 25 to 35. So they're
Mhm.
younger. They're kind of thinking about this question for the first time.
And they have a chronic illness, and they're starting to look back at the religion that maybe did some harm to them, and now they're looking at it.
It it could be that, or I'm even thinking, when I'm thinking of ancestral healing and
Mhm.
you know, thinking back to even, you know, our country obviously was founded on like a Protestant uh, founding, but if you think
Mhm.
back even further, sometimes we get into pagan roots and old Celtic kind of. Is that
Mhm.
kind of how far back you go sometimes when you're talking about this?
Sure, yeah, it depends on the person and what they're keyed into. There's for some people, obviously, the diagnosis of a chronic illness that may not be terminal at all for 5 decades is the beginning of a spiritual exploration, shall we say. And yeah, some people go back to, we say, Celtic roots, or I have some weird connection with Tibetan Buddhism. I don't know why. I met some teachers. I like the Dharma, the teachings stuck with me. But I love my Episcopalian roots. They're beautiful, the majesty of the language, and the Book of Common Prayer is like reading 17th century poetry. You know, there's a reason why John Donne and Robert Herrick and Henry Vaughan, all these old British poets. And yeah, here in America, yeah, we have a lot of creative thinking religiously, spiritually, we always have. People have come here for freedom or utopia of one sort or another, or also just to make a living and do better and survive sometimes, obviously,
Yeah.
depending on the family. So people go back to their roots. I think more now than ever. I think people are into ancestry DNA and 23andMe, and they're looking at this. And I,
Yeah.
if you find out you're 20% Scottish and you didn't know it, all of a sudden you're interested in watching Outlander or things Celtic. You know, why
It's
not?
true. It's true. Yeah. Which, you know, can be a privilege in and of itself, just knowing that certain populations don't have access to their roots. And I just want to kind of verbalize that and have an understanding of the fact that some of us, yeah, that you may not have as clear of a path to kind of looking back at your ancestors, especially if you
Yeah.
came here in the slave trade.
Oh, yeah. Well, the African American community, they're obviously some of the most spiritually observant people. I mean, the gospel tradition is
Yeah.
huge. It's extremely deep, and people wonder, oh, why aren't there more Black people doing Buddhism? You know, and it's like because they don't need it. They have a community. They've got their grandmother, their cousins, their family. If it's right there, and you know, in the neighborhood. You know, the authentic, full-bodied, you know, gospel tradition. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I like what you kind of brought up earlier. You asked the question, clarifying question around maybe if I was bringing up maybe harm that has been done by religion. And while I wasn't going there at the time, I think it's also a good place to talk about like when you're going back to your roots and trying to look at, you know, healing. And when we say healing, we're not talking about curing some chronic condition. We're just talking about healing. Actually, how would you define that word?
Healing.
Healing. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Wow. There are many degrees of healing. There's healing on the bio, the psycho, the social, and the spiritual levels, you know. And obviously, I'm interested largely in the spiritual and the psycho healing, but you need all those dimensions to work together, really. You need your interpersonal social community, and you need your, you know, you should, I mean, I'm very wary of the medical system, but I would say go get a checkup, and then it's important, you know, and
Yeah.
do what modern science can do, and don't believe everything they say, and don't get too wrapped up in. Sometimes people get talked into being part of a subject in a test, and that they get harmed by that, and that's sad to see. But healing on a spiritual level, that is the question. What is this internal healing that can happen, that can radiate outwards? This healing within, this spiritual, this finding the love within, which can also be through psychotherapy, through secular psychotherapy, is a very these are real things. And so I define it as a sense of well-being, openness, freedom, associated with warmth and luminosity, radiating compassion, being kind to yourself and others,
Yeah.
relaxed, sense of
Yeah.
humor, the good
Sense of
stuff.
humor. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah,
Yeah, being able to have an air of lightness while you're carrying some really heavy stuff.
yeah, yeah. And I don't suffer from chronic illness. You know more than I do, actually. So, but I imagine it can be really tough when it hurts to laugh, for example,
Yeah.
or or you can't breathe properly, and the effect breath has on our being is very real. I'm a very somatic person, so yeah.
Yes, yeah, that's my modality of choice, somatic experiencing, and acceptance and commitment therapy. So
Hmm.
I bring somatics a lot into therapy, and even so, yeah, there is. You're right. Like there could be a physical hurt with laughing, but also sometimes it's an emotional hurt. Feels like
Mm,
if you're laughing while you're in this much pain, then it feels either invalidating or it feels like even like getting your hopes up that things are okay and then they're not. And I think again, the spiritual aspect helps you learn to ride those waves, the ups and downs, so that you're not just expecting. Because I think the problem comes when if you're feeling let down by the fact that you're laughing now and you might not be laughing tomorrow, then that to me is a spiritual conversation. We get into the concepts of impermanence and
hmm.
all of that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in Buddhism, we say it's be careful of not getting too caught up in hopes and fears. That
Mm,
just because you're feeling better today doesn't mean it's going to be happening tomorrow or the day after. It's all about, and that's where presence comes in. Presence and but these are empty words. When someone's really suffering, sometimes all you can do is be with them, hold their hand, and
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And another thing that I was curious about when I was reading through is psychedelic therapy. Do you practice with psychedelics in your practice, or is that just something? Yeah. Can you tell me your relation to that?
Oh, psychedelics, yes. I don't do it in my practice. I am the only one that's legal. In fact, it's not really a psychedelic, is ketamine, which you're probably aware of. Um, Ketamine's considered a dissociative. So in that sense, it's close to a religious experience, because we could say that the spiritual state is a little dissociative. It's an expanse. Now that maybe that's a misuse of words, but there's some overlap there. And that's that internal spiritual healing, that expanse one can have through spiritual practice, through ketamine. I haven't done ketamine much, but my main experience is with I was part of a study at Johns Hopkins University in 2016. So I worked with Roland Griffiths and Mary Casamano. They're big. You'll see them in all the psychedelic literature that's out there. Michael Pollan spent a lot of time with them, and so I was down there. They were doing a study of long-term meditators to see what would happen if they took psilocybin, magic mushrooms. And the idea was that, and it's pretty much true, since I became a Buddhist serious practitioner, I'd stopped doing psychedelics since I was 25 or 6, 25. When I was in college, I did experiment with psychedelics. I'm of the philosophical, artistic bent, and so I was curious. And so, yeah, I think that it's a big thing right now, psychedelics. For terminal illness. It's used for obviously it's been MDMA has been used for couples counseling, and psilocybin's used for working with addictions. And but it's still not legal. So what can I say? I'm not an expert on it, but I try to stay up on it to a degree. I think it could be useful for the right clients and the right setting. What a lot of people don't understand is that psychedelic therapy involves a long-term psychotherapy before you take the substance with your counselor, with your therapist.
Yes.
So you've had weeks to you've been screened. If you know it's not appropriate if you have a history of schizophrenia and other or if you've had any recent trauma, and if you've been screened, and they may screen you if you have a chronic illness. I would think wouldn't be good for a chronic illness. Maybe the right
Mhm.
dosage would. And then you do it with the two therapists, one male and one female. Well, and so it's an interesting exploration, but it helps people cut through fear of death, terminal fear. So, and other people can learn to cut through anxiety or depression. But yeah, I don't know what maybe with I would think with chronic illness, my gut would tell me that microdosing psilocybin might be useful in terms of, but these things are more important is having a spiritual practice or a somatic practice or like your ACT practice, something that you do, something to hang it on. You're not just,
Yeah, it's not a magic cure, a pill, it's not a thing that just takes your anxiety away. It's a
right,
part of a practice.
right. It's a little boost and it's a little inspiring and it gives you a little extra energy. It's like drinking a lot of coffee, or I
Mm.
guess like Adderall. I've never, I'm not so I'm 60 years old, so there's a whole you're up on a whole new generation of things that for the future that'll be interesting to see.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is very interesting. But I like that you gave the caveat of this is, when you're thinking about psychedelics, it really is something that you need to be doing work before you dive into that therapeutic work, whether that is a spiritual practice with a spiritual mentor or therapy. Um, I
Hmm.
think that
Hmm.
too, spiritual practice, I think, and I don't know generationally, like where this changed or when, or if it's always been this way, but we're so hyper independent in this country. So I know indigenous cultures, there was always a head of the spiritual, their spiritual practice, whether it was the, a Christian pastor or, um, again, in indigenous cultures, there was someone who was heading the spiritual practices in the community. And I don't think we really have a, a strong sense of that anymore. It doesn't feel like it feels like this is all work you do on your own. I'm curious what you think about that.
Oh, yeah, it's less communal. Yeah. Well, we do have our modern day shamans in the form of certain therapists and certain priests. I do believe that. Wounded healers, which is basically what a shaman is, and they have their rattle and their and their sound, their mantric sounds, their vibrational energies. But a lot of it is the presence and the community having faith. And but it is true in any most traditional societies, there's a tight communal healing. They get the support of everyone. That's a great weakness in our culture. Another great weakness in our culture is Christianity, the Judeo-Christian, I'd say the Judeo-Christian tradition is very disembodied. So we're coming, we don't, that this whole mind-body split is, I'm 60 years old. So when I was your age, you were considered kind of new agey or weird to talk about the mind-body connection through the medium of the breath, body, speech, mind, breath. And now that's normalized. And in terms of communities, people find their tribes, as they say in your generation. I think, so I think I always have hope for humans to find their communities in their own way. I hope people are getting back together as humans.
I think it's, for those of us with a chronic illness, it is so hard because COVID can be so detrimental to somebody with, it can be detrimental to anyone. There were perfectly healthy people that died in this this era, but I have lots of
Yeah.
clients still struggling with the reopening and connecting with folks because of the potential for harm that can come to them because of what their body is dealing with already.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a
And
close friend who had celiac disease who had to stay home. She was a therapist and they fired her. Can you believe
oh,
that?
oh,
Because she wouldn't go into the office. It was, I mean, she wanted to work from home with the clients and
yeah, I know it.
yeah.
I think that's less common here in Atlanta, but anywhere outside of Atlanta, that I can see that happening very easily. But it is really sad, especially when I mean, I think part of it too is insurance companies deciding we're no longer paying for telehealth and whatnot, and
Mm,
that definitely,
yeah.
it's the systems. This is back. It's systems, right?
Yeah.
You put
Yeah.
something like insurance regulations, and then all of a sudden you can't do your job if you're not coming into the office, and it's just sad because
It is sad. It is sad. It is sad. And the pandemic, I hope it's over. I like to think it's over, but maybe I delude myself. I have hopes and fears. I have
I hear that. I
yeah.
as well. Um, yeah, there was another question that came to mind as we were talking about. You mentioned something around it's more commonplace now to be talking about the mind body connection, and I think it is more commonplace. People are starting to understand it. And I will take your hope for the future, and that hopefully we can integrate it better, because right now a lot of times it feels like a conversation that's being had, but then again through insurance mandates or just people doing things the way they have always done them for the last 10-15 years. Like they might be talking the talk, but there isn't this real integration between the mind and body. And we get into therapy and it's still just, how do you change your thoughts? How do you change your thoughts? How do you change your
No,
thoughts?
is it yeah, yeah. The cognitive angle. Well, there are things like cognitive therapy with slogans, mind training slogans, we call them in Tibetan Buddhism, Lojong, mind training. And the thing is there that those slogans are integrated with the teachings as a whole. It's not just some isolated watch your brain. It's integrated with your sense of absolute and relative truth. It's integrated with all of your highest ideals. It's not just tracking the brain and but yeah, we do that's what I like about my Buddhist practices. It has practices of the body, the speech, and the mind. So it does have the cognitive practices, but it also has the mantra and the breath work and the physical postures and yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. From what I can tell, you know more about this than I do, but I imagine ACT and DBT and some of the other some of these other um, intervention modalities might involve the body more, right? Don't-
I think so. I think that's kind of where I was getting at though earlier, is that in practice, I think there's still a large disconnect between the mind and body, even when we're talking about it. And I think it's because people have done exactly what you kind of just described, where you take this one piece out of a spiritual practice and you say, oh, this is an antidote, or this is the cure to anxiety, to depression. And now we're going to kind of spin off that and then recreate this whole new, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, right. I mean, evidence-based. A lot of evidence-based practices are questionable because they have to find the ideal people to use as subjects who have a one illness, and then you have to home in on one treatment modality. So it's all very questionable. I think psychotherapy is more of an art than a science, and
I think it should
all,
be.
although I'm glad but I think that some of these things have helped people, ACT and DBT and IFS, I suppose, and MBSR. The only one I've done of those four is MBSR, really, and
That
I
makes
found
sense.
I found it very kind of more beginning level. It's about stress reduction. It's more secular, and yeah, but people go from there, and then they might go to a meditation retreat and then read more Buddhist books and go more deeply into it. But it's very entry level stuff, you know.
I think that's a good way to put it because everybody needs to enter somewhere, right? And so
Yeah,
if
yeah.
that is our entry level, especially again, like in America, we don't have really a strong, even though we have Protestant roots and there's a strong spirituality, like, you know, there's pieces of spirituality. There's also this kind of hyper independence. So we don't really have this strong communal sense of community. And
Mm,
I think that um, you got to start somewhere. So, you know, there's this entry level, whether that's CBT or ACT or DBT, if that gets you into a practice and then it evolves from there, then
mhm.
that's all, you know, that's all we can ask for, right?
Yeah, yeah, and then you can find your community and further refine your tribe and find a nice group of people that's not too culty. Where,
Definitely.
where it's a
Yeah.
little, yeah, yeah.
How can you speak a little bit to like community? It sounds like so maybe even for you where you found your community and your spirituality. Can you speak a little bit to that? Just finding community.
Finding community. Well, I'm a married man of 27 years, and I have two adult daughters, 21 and 24. So that's kind of the center of my community. And then I belong to a wonderful poetry writing group on Sundays. That's one part of my tribe. Because I have these overlapping interests of poetry and spirituality and psychotherapy. So spiritually, I've always been more of a independent yogi than a real belong to the sangha, what we call the sangha person. But now, as I get older, I'm more less defensive and more relaxed and want to just share or not share my experiences with all kinds of people and so yeah, I'm taking some initial steps to joining a community of Tibetan Buddhists out in Colorado. Dzigar Kongtrul Rinpoche, I like his work, and then Nyingma tradition, Nyingmapa tradition, and because they're from the lineage of a teacher named Dingo Kensei Rinpoche. He was died in 91 or so. So I had gurus, and so therefore, yeah, there's communal things around that. I wouldn't say it's a cult, but it's cult like to our eyes. It's very foreign, odd, and my humble working class grandparents weren't so happy when I got involved in that. They're old time Methodists, and I
Uh,
know I know you're in Atlanta, so you have a lot of that tradition, the Bible Belt, and
yeah.
yeah, everyone's community is a little different, and yeah, I did.
Yeah.
Sometimes I joined the Episcopal Church. Recently, I went through a phase where I was involved in my local Episcopal church, and I was a Eucharistic minister, and I loved it. It was wonderful. I got back in with my roots and the cadence and the language and the majesty of the Episcopal Church. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. My introduction to really spirituality and really just mindfulness in general was Thich Nhat Hanh. And that's really the foundation. I mean, I had a professor in undergrad who like just nailed ACT into our head. And this was before, way before I could practice, but it was between, acceptance and commitment therapy because it has very Buddhist undertones.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and then, yeah, I read a lot of Thich Nhat Hanh, and that
Mm,
was kind of my
yeah.
entryway, if you will.
Yeah, he's an amazing crossover figure in that, close to Martin Luther King back in the 60s. So he has that social justice side to him and
Mhm.
anti-war. And then he has he's written books about Christianity also and that overlap. And he's been a real role model. I actually was trained as a chaplain by a rabbi who'd read all of Thich Nhat Hanh. That was his, his
Yeah.
yeah. And then I've worked with some people in the hospice industry that are part of his community. Yeah,
Yeah. That's
yeah.
beautiful. Is there anything else that comes to mind today, just about spirituality and kind of dealing with suffering? I know, chronic illness, not necessarily, it's just the suffering of life, which chronic illness definitely brings along with it. So
Mhm.
Any kind of thoughts you would want to leave people with around suffering and spirituality?
Well, I'd say that's exactly right. I think people who suffer from chronic illness are more in tune with the reality of suffering. And we talk about the four marks of existence in Buddhism: birth, old age, sickness, and death. I mean, old age, sickness, and death will come to all of us. And so I know it's overused that these people with chronic illnesses, that's also their superpower, but it's often true. People learn by learning to cope. I think what they learn to do is what I've seen over and over again is people not just wanting to feel better themselves, but they get better themselves through prayer, if you want to call it, for other people, for dead people they've known that have given love to them, and prayer for other people. They're attuned to the heartbreak in the Ukraine, for example.
Mm.
So there's a certain tender, sad beauty to it all, and so I think that there are time and again I noticed that the people with chronic illnesses were my teachers. I'd go in there and I ended up learning more from them, than they did from me.
Absolutely.
So so that's about it. These are commonplace things, but it's worth always tuning into them, right? Because we get busy. We
Yeah.
cover things up. We get busy making a living, Christmas, shopping, Thanksgiving, mishigas, craziness, and
Mhm.
traffic and noise. And yeah, we can lose touch with what really matters.
Yeah, that's really what my work is all about, is finding ways to have touch points to the things that matter, while living
Yeah.
with a chronic illness, because it does add just one more thing that overtakes your mind and distracts you from what matters in your life. So,
Yeah. 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 The people you love and your own love within, and finding that, tuning into that.
yeah,
Yeah.
great. Well, I really appreciate you being here and talking to me.
Okay.
It
Well,
was a
great.
pleasure.
Thank you, and keep up the good work, and may it benefit many people, both therapists and clients.
I hope
Okay.
so. I hope so. Thanks, Matt.
All right. Bye
Talk
now.
to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
If you learned something new today, consider writing it down in your phone notes or journal and make that new neural pathway light up. Better yet, I'd love to hear from you. Send me a DM on Instagram, email me, or leave a voice memo for us to play on the next show. The way you summarize your takeaways can be the perfect little soundbite that someone else might need in order to better absorb the same lesson. Lastly, leaving a review really helps others find this podcast, so please do so if you found this episode helpful.